Good evening, good morning, good afternoon to you, wherever you are in the world. I am Tigress Osborn. I'm the chair of the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance, and welcome to the NAAFA webinar series. Today we are joined by two very special guests, Athia Choudhury and Sonalee Rashatwar. We are also joined by we'll get to our guests in just a moment. We are also joined by our friends from Pro Bono ASL who are interpreting today's meeting. Today our interpreters are Irina and Nathanael. You can find more information about Pro Bono ASL on their website at probonoasl.com. You can find more information about us, the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance, on our website, NAAFA.org, NAAFA.org. I am calling in today from the greater Phoenix area, and I am specifically on O'odham land. We encourage you, those of you who are here with us live today, to share in the chat where you are from, both what we call it and what the indigenous people, who the indigenous people are of the place where you are. If you don't know that information, it's just a Google away, so please take a look. Our admin will also share in the chat a specific link where you can look it up, and we encourage you all to share that with each other. So before we get into our guests, one more thing. I do want to let you all know that as part of our Pride celebrations, we have two more upcoming webinars that we'd like you to know about. This Saturday at 10 a.m. Pacific, we have a special co-sponsored presentation with our friends from Drag Queen Story Hour, with a special Drag Queen Story Hour hosted by Miss Terracotta Sugarbaker. So we encourage you to check our website, learn more about that, naafa.org/webinars. We also have one coming up at the end of the month on June 25th that will be a panel of folks talking about the intersections of fatness and non-binary gender spectrum. So please be on the lookout for more details about that. Registration is at our website. Okay, now let me introduce you to our two fabulous folks for today so we can get them talking instead of me. Athia Choudhury, she, her, is a doctoral candidate. Do we still call you a candidate when you finished this?
I think I'm just a PhD now.
I think you are too. So first, congratulations to Athia, who has completed a PhD in American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California. She is a recipient of the Wallis Annenberg Endowed Fellowship and has earned a graduate certificate in Gender and Sexuality Studies. Athia specializes in Asian American transnational feminisms and postcolonial theory with emphasis on 20th century body politics and militarized food cultures. She has taught courses on race, gender, sexuality, and the body at both the University of Southern California and Pomona College, as well as facilitated public workshops on race, identity, and belonging at various institutions. In the fall of 2002, Athia will join Duke University as the Postdoctoral Associate in Asian American and Diaspora Studies. Her current project, Gut Cultures, Fat Matters in Genealogy of Health, Nation, and Empire, engages a diverse array of cultural and visual text, postcolonial literatures, and multi-ethnic sound spaces to thicken the relationship between nation, desire, and the science of health from a decolonial fat studies and disability studies lens. Gut Cultures, traces appetites as viscera, practice, compulsion, genre across cultural histories of powdered and skim milk. We're going to get into that during the webinar. Representations of the gut and women's eating and the productive power of metabolic personhood in American empire. Athia's writing is published forthcoming in the Journal of Transnational American Studies, Disability Studies Quarterly, the Routledge International Handbook of Fat Studies, and the German anthology Fat Studies, Doing, Becoming, and Being Fat. Thank you for joining us, Athia. I would also like to introduce you to Sonalee Rashatwar, he, LCSW MED, who is an award-winning clinical social worker, sex therapist, adjunct lecturer, and grassroots organizer. Based in Philly, licensed in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, they are a super fat queer bisexual non-binary therapist and co-owner of Radical Therapy Center, specialized in treating sexual trauma, diet trauma, racial or immigration trauma, and South Asian family abuse while offering fat-positive sexual health care. Popularly known as the fat sex therapist, I like to say it Meg the Stallion, the fat sex therapist on Instagram. Their notoriety first peaked when they were featured on Breitbart in March of 2018 for naming thinness as a white supremacist beauty ideal. And they continue to draw the ire of white supremacists everywhere, with controversial statements on intersectional fat liberation since then. Sonalee is a sought-after speaker who travels internationally to curate custom visual workshops that whisper to our change-making spirit and nourish our vision for a more just future. Sonalee is not paid for their labor as a community organizer, where they have fundraised and facilitated a 5-day free political action summer camp for LGBT plus South Asian and Indo-Caribbean youth. Sonalee received their Master of Social Work and Master of Education in Human Sexuality from Widener University in 2016 and have been working in the field of anti-violence for 10 plus years. Ladies and gentlemen and friends of all gens, please welcome Sonalee Rashatwar and Athia Choudhury to the NAAFA webinar series. Thank you both for being here.
What an introduction.
I know. I'm kind of like, whoa.
Because they're so epic.
Thank you, Tigress.
You're really setting the stage here.
The stage is yours. I know that y'all have some questions you want to ask each other, so I will jump in. Folks in the chat can also post questions, and I'll highlight those for y'all. But I'll let you start where you want to start.
Thank you so much. We want to say a belated happy AAPI Heritage Month. And belated, not in a bad way, because we don't respect colonial time.
Absolutely. Diaspora is a temporally belated position. That's where we're at.
And we are proud of it.
Mm-hmm.
Before we begin this conversation, this is really topically going to be putting on the map. No, that feels unfair. Adding to the dialogue, adding to the conversation, some perspectives on Asian fatness. And so I think it's important for us to locate ourselves as Asian fats, as diasporic fats. What do you think?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. How would you describe your...
I would describe myself as a child of many diasporas. I'm born to a family of immigrants. My dad is originally from Bangladesh. My mom is from Thailand. I was born in Long Island and spent most of my young adulthood in Florida. So trash bag through and through, love it, here for it, just full of it. And spent many years, many summers living in Bangladesh, living in Thailand, and primarily being raised on the Florida tides of the American South. And so much of my work, so much of my politics and the way in which I move through the world is definitely indebted to the places this flesh has traveled.
Oh, you're such a poet every time you speak. I am a child of Indian immigrants. Both of my parents migrated from the subcontinent, albeit in different waves. My mom was one of the first families to arrive in the South in the early mid-70s. And my mom is from an upper caste family. And so her father has a master's degree or came for a master's degree. And my dad's side is lower caste. And he came in the migration wave of the 80s and came also for a master's and doctoral degree. And I was born in New Jersey, so also an East Coast baby. I grew up in a place that was not really based in much Asian heritage. I didn't know much about my Indian history until maybe later in my elementary and middle school years, when we really found culture through a Hindu temple, which is like kind of a sticky place to get your culture from, given the ways that Hindu fascism has a lot of its ties in how the diaspora will learn anything about Hindu or Indian culture. So I think it's really important to frame this conversation within AAPI Heritage Month. And much of the popular framing that ends up happening during Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, which, like, we're not even going to get into the clunkiness of the collection of identities of AAPI, right? Much of the framing during this month, the conversations, the podcasts, the interviews really look like signaling racial injury and grievance to a lay audience so that Asians, AAPIs, become more legible. And legible instead of what? What is the conversation that we need to be having?
Thank you so much for bringing that up, especially the way in which you're situating it, even your own relationship to class consciousness, political organizing, or political consciousness. You know, I grew up in a Muslim household, also in a predominantly spaces without Asians in them, besides my family. And the way in which I came into my Asianness and my sense of political activism was in a post 9/11 era. And so much of the war on obesity bleeds into the war on terror in these really interesting ways, right? To sort of define and conscript the body within the national citizen subject. And so when we talk about sort of like the racial injury of, or us having to place ourselves like where we come from, locationally, politically, economically, our relationship to education and class status, gender, and all of those different kinds of things, it becomes a really important question, right? Especially because of the ways in which Asian American, as the sort of like constellation of identity markers, is so contested, right? And there's something about like the figure of the inscrutable Asian that, you know, people in these sort of like popular organizing spaces are trying to push against, right? Like we have to make sense of the sort of racial grievance and racial injury on this sort of like body of people who come from such different histories. And oftentimes that leaves it or leaves us in this mode of wondering like, okay, so if we have to start from so many different places of orientation, what's the theory, right? Like, what's the thing, the unified thing that we could take away from this in order to move forward in our liberation praxis, or the ways in which we, think about freedom and justice. And part of that is what's so unique about a third world feminist or transnational or Asian American diaspora kind of analysis that we see very much missing from fat studies and disability studies, right? Is this like moment to think about contention and conflict and multiple points of entry into these very fundamental questions about like, how does the nation shape the body and vice versa? Or, like, how do we come to understand our relationship to food and eating as it's mitigated through transnational currents of desire and, commodity circuits? And so that's, I'm talking too much, but let me stop right now. Anyway, we need to thicken the discourse is what I'm going to say. That's going to be the theme for today.
I love this idea of thickening discourse. And also I want to break down some of these ideas too, because while I'm pretending like I understand so much of it, like I do understand a lot of it, okay? A lot. And the inscrutable Asian, it does this primarily pinpoint to the ways that we fall between the crack of a black and white binary.
Mm-hmm. So, this inscrutable Asian, it's a figure that hovers in Asian American studies, right? And it's used to describe the sort of two primary functions, which is one, the inability of Asian Americanist or Asian American political organizing figures to come up with a cohesive list of demands or grievances when so much of, the projects right now are about within rights-based discourses, right? Like, I mean, these are very important things. Like, we need to be protected from and by the state at the same time. How do we make those claims, right? So part of that is like being able to make yourself legible on the state level. And then it's sort of on the other hand, it is about the way in which violence against Asian bodies, or the ways that Asian bodies are rendered as ornaments and objects, right, become something unfamiliar or unrelatable to a lay audience or the everyday audience. I was writing about this the other day. Have you all seen the Pixar short Bao with the little dumplings, right? And so, there was this whole argument that was happening at the time where people were in the audience. It's just a very typical story of like a mother-son relationship, about growing apart, about distance and love and family and all these very typical normal things that everyday people can relate to. And yet there was something about it being set within these sort of like Asiatic objects that made it impossible to digest by white audiences, because people kept reporting how white people were talking about how confusing it was. Excuse me. So what was confusing about that?
Yeah, what is confusing about that? I totally agree. And so when you're talking about inscrutability, you're talking about writing ourselves into existence. You're talking about helping an audience to understand where we exist. You're talking about also the tension between needing to be recognized by the state so that we can be written into law. Law doesn't sound right, but also requiring protection from the state. I'm thinking of like, you were describing post 9/11. I'm thinking of Islamophobia. I'm thinking about U.S. empire and nationalism.
Absolutely. It's also about how we learn to think of ourselves as Asian American, right? Or what are the boundaries of Asianness as we come to understand them? And so much of that is through proximity, through touch. Like for people who grow up in largely, predominantly Asian American communities, that experience looks very different, right? If you're a West Coast Asian, a Bay Area Asian versus an Asian from the South, or in the Midwest or in the East Coast, like it's so contingent. Like the experiences that you have throughout your life puts you to sort of uncertain proximities with even the sense of politics or the sense of racial grievance. So there's so many layers in which Asian American embodiment and Asian American politics is hard to digest for so many people involved, right? All the people involved.
The billions of people involved.
Absolutely.
So what is it that binds us together as a continent? Why do we get grouped as AAPI? Is it third world feminisms?
You know what? I would say that third world feminisms sort of gives us this entryway to think more deeply about how we're bound together. We were talking about this the other day, and I would love to hear more about your experiences with being told like fatness is a first world issue. Like I want to sort of delve into these divisions between first world issues versus third world issues in relation to how we understand body politics and how we parse up the world in these different kinds of ways. And maybe that's an entryway into that question, because so much of what my work is focused on is like, okay, so we have this figure of the inscrutable Asian. And so Asian American Studies as a field is pushing back against all of these preconceived notions about what it can offer to a larger theory of embodiment or enfleshment. We often see, fat studies and disability studies having to grapple with race in this period of time, but it comes from a very specific angle, right? It comes from a Black feminist tradition, which is very rich, but we're oftentimes completely missing the conversation about the Asian body, right? And so part of my question is understanding like why, in terms of the scholarship on race in the body, do we not find the Asian figure? But also, why does Asian American studies and diaspora studies not theorize the body either? So we've got these two sort of contradictions at hand. And third world feminisms, or how the world has been sort of mapped out, or how the body problems have been parsed out through the global North versus the global South. That's an interesting moment for us to kind of sit with. So maybe you could kind of talk about your experience, or like open up that conversation with like, how have you been told where and when the body becomes a problem?
I have been told that my body becomes a problem around fatness and gender, and gender in being successful within heterosexism. And part of those conversations happen within my family. And I really describe some of my early experiences being put on non-consensual diets from a young age, like 10 and 11, being encouraged to restrict food, being discouraged from eating enough until fullness, being told what kinds of clothes to wear so as to hide the shape of my body. And a lot of these conversations happening at a time when I was also approaching or was in full swing of puberty. I was like the size of, my mother and I were the same size, and I was maybe like age 10 or 11, and she was like in her late 30s, and we were wearing the same size of clothing. So if I use that imagery to signal that like I was going to be a large adult if I was already that large as a child. And of course it didn't feel good, but I really do believe my parents were trying to teach me, my immigrant parents, trying to teach me how to survive white supremacy and capitalism. They were both also like small fat, maybe even like in between size people. And I didn't know this until recently, but my dad grew up as a fat kid, like mercilessly bullied. And so what he carried with him was this like plea, like, I really don't want you to have to go through what I went through. And so what that meant for me was like experiencing so much pressure to lose weight, endless pressure to try a new diet or a new pill or a residential weight loss program. Like we went to pretty extreme lengths. I saw an Ayurvedic doctor, and I'm actually like so stuck on like, why is it that Asian studies doesn't study the body? Like, is it a departure from like the ability to, because when I think of how I came back to my body after years of being pressured to shrink my body, pleasure was like this incredible, important way to feel embodied, to reclaim my body, to have agency over my body, to feel like I had body autonomy and self-determination. And albeit it was a clunky venture into like sexual pleasure, and there were a lot of mistakes made along the way. But does Asian studies not study the body because of like a weird relationship to pleasure? That also feels like a racist thing to say.
You bring up a lot of really interesting points, and I'm thinking a lot. My brain is like moving in a lot of different directions. Thank you, first of all, for sharing. I feel like the journey that you mapped out in terms of your relationship to forced diets and forced restriction, and just the lengths in which your parents went to or your family went to in order to slim you down. It really is a mode of protecting you from a white supremacist society. Like that completely maps out in so many ways to my own experience. And I oftentimes think like, okay, so what does it mean for me to be the inheritor of histories of famine and starvation and to be a fat body, right? And how does that feel for someone like my father, who, has really been able to communicate his sense of love, emotion, and all the other things he's unable to say, verbally through food. Yeah. Right? Like how that becomes communicated through food, and like how does food become the medium in which Asian diaspora, Asian immigrants really are able to express complex emotions, complex grief. And, hearing you speak about this, it just makes it so apparent, right, that there's some deep-seated colonial body trauma happening here. And part of my research and thinking about nation and health and wellness in this way is to really track how for our revolutionary figures, right? Like the revolutionary figures, I mean, even Gandhi has all of this work on Swadeshi that is just, I know, right? Ooh, problematic figure.
This anti-Black myth.
I know, but also has all of this writing about digestion in the gut, right? As he takes it, on Swadesh, this is really about taming the stomach, taming the gut. And so there's something here in this moment of resistance to imperial colonial rule that stems from really making your body fit and strong and healthy enough to physically fight off empire. I think about this all the time, how like my dad immigrated to the US in the 1970s. He was like 17 years old, and he had to, put together some fraudulent paperwork because nobody really knows when he was born, right? Just January 1st. This is kind of an experience for a lot of immigrants from South Asia at the time. And this skinny Bangladeshi kid being racialized for the first time in his life. What did he do? He found a dojo in New York City, and he started practicing martial arts, right? And this was also this sort of time in which chopsaki cinema was really making its way. You had everybody was kung fu fighting as this sort of like anthem. So like really all of these kinds of entanglements and relationships to race, fitness, the body, so much of it is about a traumatic relationship to what it means to be rolled over, to what it means to be told you don't have the capacity for self-governance and sovereignty, right? And these this question of capacity, sovereignty, governance shows up when we think about the history of the American calorie, right? Mm-hmm. What is the function of the calorie in the first place, or what is the function of diet in the first place? Like we think about, when we think about food studies and the United States, we think about McDonald's, right? How the US brought processed foods and fatty, unhealthy things into indigenous and native foodways. But what we don't think about is how the US's primary export in the 20th century was healthism, right? And diet culture. And so like we have all of this, I think that people are really wising up right now and are saying like, diet culture is toxic. Diet culture is part of a colonial agenda. It's a settler practice. But like part of my contribution is sort of like in the background being like, okay, so I'm going to do this archival research for you all. Here you go. These are the facts. It's true. All of it is true. And this is the history. This is the story. This is how. And so that's part of the sort of like work,
And it brings me back to this question that you started with, which is fat studies a first world conversation, which is some of the pushback that I get in leftist spaces where fatness is still not integrated or fat studies as like a perspective worthy of rallying around us.
Yeah.
And leftist loves of mine wonder if like super fats exist and infinifats exist in the third world.
Yeah, that's like That is a question that it's the wrong question, is what I want to say. Ultimately, like, that's the wrong question to be asking. But the right question to be asking, I don't necessarily want to say right, but the more critical question to be asking, right, is like, how are we all imbricated in, healthism's delight across the globe? Right? How does the language of optimization and wellness and fitness and healthfulness like really bleed into our everyday to make life untenable? And especially like this question of then, if we think of the native, the pure native body, right? Frantz Fanon tells us that we can never go back, right? There's no way to go back, to the motherland or to the homeland unchanged. Every moment of contact, you're already ultimately changed in perceivable and imperceivable ways, right? But this idea, like the native or the natural body, is one that is inherently thin, healthy, abled, in itself perpetuates like a capitalist settler understanding of like who we are and who we want in our future, right? So I'm not interested in sort of like excavating in the past, like, oh, fat people were here, fat people were there. We know fat people have always existed. We know this for a fact. Body diversity, like body difference, has always existed. That's not an argument that I'm interested in having, but rather to say, like, do you understand your investment in thinness and how that connects to these other projects of nation making or global capitalism or white supremacy?
Okay, I have to jump forward and I have to ask the big question. And third world feminisms have always talked about this tension.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
How does a fledgling nation make itself cohesive?
Absolutely.
How did the US use diet culture, healthism, motherfucking eugenics to make itself cohesive?
Yeah. So, like, this is the thing that I find so interesting, coming out of the dissertation, spending all these years with my books. Like, I realized, like, I never had a class specifically that dealt with the literature from third world feminisms, right? This was reading that I did in undergrad, reading that I had to do independently for my quals. And there was something here that I found really interesting or fishy, right? Because like it would be referenced in passing, but it's actually quite like buried underneath a lot of things. Like if we think about the trajectory or the history genealogy of women of color feminisms, Black feminism, which has truly like received or is receiving the attention it deserves in the academy, right? Rightly. There's a way in which like third world women's organizing, thinking, and politics, which were super entangled in these formations at the time, really get forgotten, right? Or downplayed in certain ways, like revisiting like the Third World Liberation Front, their sort of like Triple Women Jeopardy newsletters and like the sort of like archival material that we have available. We recognize that like people were having these really messy, complicated, complex questions and problems and growing their thoughts together in this moment. And what third world feminisms really offered at the time and offer us now is a way to think about not only, that postcolonial or transnational critique to like American studies or, people in the West, where they say like, hey, we need to talk about local to global. We need to, we need to talk about how like America is not the primary catalyst for all of these different issues, but how we have to talk about transnational global flows, blah, blah, blah. And so this was a huge moment, in the 1980s, 1990s, where we have to think about empire in stickier terms, and the work has to like zoom in on one geographical site and sort of, to explain very particularly how politics works in that place. But what I find missing from that is that you can sometimes lose out on the threads of how images, ideas, and sort of like memes, right, circulate between nationalist projects, right? Like we miss out on this sort of like, so the third world feminist critique is always about like nation and like globe, right? Like nation, globe, and how to think about the languages in between, and how third world women's bodies are literal bodies that are circulated as commodity, that are circulated as flesh, but also circulated as principles in which to understand the modernization of the fledgling nation state, right? And so there's a way that, like, by turning to this, these particular ways of thinking, we can, actually delve a little deeper. And I know you brought up skimmed milk a little earlier, but like part of my fascination with skimmed milk is like how it came into political consciousness and how it's been used by both like white supremacist men in the United States in 2016, as well as by Hindu nationalists in the 1980s, specifically around like Hindu nationalist women who are trying to protect their nation from the Muslim intruder figure.
I want to build on that connection. And before I do that, I want to make sure that we seat the responsibility of including third world feminisms on not the shoulders of Black feminists, because
Absolutely.
I do think that we work in solidarity with each other.
Absolutely.
So who receives that responsibility? I want to make sure that that is like really explicit before I move to the next.
Can you explain what you mean by like who receives the responsibility?
Like when you say like we've been forgotten, right? Or like we don't get included, or we're not.
Oh, yes. I don't think it's it's part of like trends, right? Part of it's like academic trends in terms of like who we see value in studying. Again, I think it's like partly because of inscrutability. Partly it's because, third world feminisms fell out of fashion to be transplanted with transnational feminisms. So they're like all of these sort of cyclical genealogical questions. But honestly, I think it's so much about the makeup and the shape of the academy and the sort of like neoliberal practices about where we have the quote unquote funds to place resources in. And so much of that is just like a puppetry in reaction to like, how much of the shit pie can we give to, how big of a slice of the shit pie can we give to everyone? And so this responsibility in recovering or in like situating ourselves in third world feminist politics and philosophy and ways of being, it's not the fault of individuals, but a system, right, that really pits us against each other. Whereas like, I'm not assigning blame or saying like, oh, this is, we have to like take up more space in certain ways, but really to just say like, there's this huge opportunity for us, right, to expand in these very important and interesting ways. And like, can we dream bigger? Fuck yes, we can. That's where I'm at right now.
Thank you. Thank you for adding to that. I just want to make sure that it was explicitly stated. And to go back to your milk imagery, what I really hear when you are naming how women are used as, or so much pressure is put on women to pass down tradition, culture, language, holidays, is I really hear a lot of the pressure that comes from Brahminical patriarchy and caste supremacy within Hinduism, within Hindutva, within India, especially right now in this moment where we are seeing the homes of Muslim residents be razed to the ground in India the same way we are seeing homes being demolished in occupied Palestine. And there is this correlation that is really important to name, which you're pointing out is like these fascist, proto-fascist symbols. How and why is milk? How did that happen?
I am still sometimes reeling about the fact that like I'm a milk scholar in some ways, you know. When I started this dissertation, that was not the plan, but it really served for, okay, so the thinking about milk, for those of you who don't know, like skimmed milk is actually like originally a waste discharge from the process of creaming milk for butter and all of the other, you know, full fat stuff, full fat cream, all these things. And it was such a like sore and an environmental sore in the United States from like the 1920s into the 1940s that would literally like just fester and pile up in these like ditches and streams, really disrupting the image of the pastoral. And, you know, even though the United States was like going through the Great Depression, it was like austerity measures everywhere, people would not drink skim milk. Americans were like, this is disgusting. We're not going to drink it. They tested powdered skim on babies in the tropics and tried to be like, they're alive, they're healthy, and we're bringing nutrition to these babies in the tropics. They tested it out on inner city kids in Baltimore who were underweight. They tested it out in native boarding schools, all of these different sites in which like the state comes to manage the bodies of poor people of color, children, etc. But I started thinking about skimmed milk because when I was living in Bangladesh, you know, as an American kid, I was really missing, you know, being with my friends, being home, being with my family. And my dad would make us every day for breakfast this thing of cold cereal, which is like a flattened rice cereal. And he'd mix the powder, mix some sugar and some water, and then give it to me. And I'm like, this is disgusting. It doesn't taste like milk and cereal. Why are you giving me this? I want milk. And, you know, he would say, this is healthier for you. You know, this is better for you. It's safer for you. And I started to think, like, as I was writing this chapter, like, why? Why is it that we think that this product that comes from the US or Europe in a powdered form is safer than fresh milk from the cattle or dairy farms or dairy cooperatives in these local areas? And it led me onto this huge study about the ways in which like skimmed milk was used during World War II, right, as a sort of food aid, food relief. And it was later marketed to white women in the United States as a miracle elixir that will help them lose weight. And at the same time in Asia, it was sent over to India and China in these large things of powdered bags to sort of create an appetite for dairy, while India and China began their own sort of national dairy cooperatives, right? And that was the way in which they thought they would become modern citizens of their nation states. There was the way in which like milk operated in these very distinct trajectories, one offering the promise of heterofuturity and romance for the thin or thinning American housewife, right? That sort of solidified the fantasy of the nuclear family. And on the other hand, it offered the frail, starving, hungry Asian this ability to grow big and strong, right? This capacity to present itself on the global stage as a nation in its own right. And so like observing these two things, it really just like puts into focus, right, this idea of the nation, of, you know, this sort of like beliefs about the fit body and the citizen, right? And what does that look like? What does that performance look like? And where are these values coming from?
I really hear in that the connection between skim milk, powdered milk, fatness, and the nation state. And it feels like one of the strong connections between one of those exports you were describing of US empire and diet culture and healthism. And it makes me think about how we have such stark imagery between like thin girls in mukbang and the starving Asian. and who gets to eat food and enjoy it.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Thank you for bringing that up. I talk a lot about that in my chapter about the inscrutable Asian and like thinking about this figure of the starving Asian, right? That populates food literacy and food aid literature, right? It's often, I was just like, it's often described that like Asia is the principal site of famine in the world, right? Asian Africa, people are naturally starving. They're predisposed to it. There's a way in which even the literature presented by relief programs really have the sense of like, these bodies over here are naturally going to be starving, right? They're naturally not going to be able to tend their own land or, account for their people or, produce enough, or they're in naturally bad places, right? With drought and, other kinds of natural disasters without really thinking about the extractive processes of the West that leave these lands untenable and unlivable, from the climate crisis to literal extraction, right? And so there's this mythology that comes in hand about like the figure of the starving Asian, right? We all hear the joke like from mothers telling their kids, you should finish your food because there are children starving in Asia, there are children starving in Africa. So what does that actually tell us about what kinds of bodies live in these spaces, right? What kinds of food issues are where? And yet at the same time, right now we're seeing this over proliferation in like performances on the internet of Asians eating on the internet, right? Like mukbang content is some of the like most mesmerizing and most watched content out there of, people predominantly like young, thin, pretty Asian women, Korean women eating large quantities of food. And there's something pleasurable about watching it, something erotic about watching it. But it also does this magical work of no matter how much they eat, no matter how full they get, their bodies never change. So that tells us also the story of how like the Asian femme body is seen as stagnant because she is an object of desire, because she is an object to be contained and held and owned in all of these different kinds of ways. Like the biological process of eating and digestion can't affect her, right? It doesn't change her. And so it presents like a really weird, bizarre thing around, how we interpret both this, idea that Asian countries are unable to feed its people, that they're poverty ridden, and that they're, they don't have the capacities for sovereignty. And yet at the same time, you see, especially from East Asia, like specifically Korea, this proliferation of media around like, look at how much food we have. But also look at how we maintain our figures, even though we have all of this food, which is also really interesting to juxtapose with like all of the articles like that you see about the West freaking out about the changing body chemistry of people in East and South Asia. They're like, China's unquenchable thirst for milk and cow meat, and Malaysia's fast food obsession. Like it's so fixated on the changing body chemistry of Asia that it's really a way to talk about a fear of global capital growing in these places.
Mm. Which leads me to wonder, and I know we should be conscious of time, right, Tigress?
Oh, yes.
Right,
sometimes, I got that academic issue where I just like keep going off and like, hopefully I'm saying something. So just like...
You literally are always, but it further emphasizes how the Asian fat body exists as deviant from this like stereotype, this like really convenient assumption.
Oh my gosh, it is so deviant. The fear of it is so prevalent. All you have to do is go to a lunch with your Asian aunties for like 2 seconds. And what's the first thing that they're going to say to you? You're getting so fat, but here, eat my food. I'll be very offended if you don't eat, but you're getting real fat, so like, that fear, I feel, again, it's this response to trauma. It comes from a place of protection. It comes from a place of really like sort of like protecting the image of the model minority. Like, can you, move up in the world? I remember when I first moved out to LA, and I was traveling the metro system with my mom, and we got lost. And of course, this like uncle from New Delhi just like pops up out of nowhere. He's like, I will help you ladies get to where you need to be. I'm going to be an everyday hero. And he's like really sweet, really charming. He's like a retired mechanical engineer. And he like could immediately sense that my mom was from Thailand and all of these things. And they were chatting. And then he asked like, oh, what are you doing in LA? And I was like, I'm starting my PhD here. And I was like really excited about it. And he's like, he gets really serious all of a sudden. He's like, listen, I have been with academics my entire life, and I have to tell you, you need to lose the weight. Oh. They will not accept you. They will make they will accept these people will accept a lot of things, but they will not accept you being fat. You're young, do this for your life. Bus, that's it. And so what is this interruption here? It is both violence and tenderness. It is both like a fear and a sense of protection of this figure of the model minority who can rise in a system that is inherently built against us. And so like, I can't hate this man. I can't be like, you are a terrible human being, but I can empathize with the kinds of rhetoric, the kinds of traumas that he had to experience in his life to think this way, because so many of us do.
I heard almost the identical same thing. And the thesis of this conversation tonight, the function of why we are here to have this conversation was we wanted to pose this question of like, what do third world feminisms have to add to the canon of fat studies? And we hope that in this conversation, you can take away one or more nuggets, cross our fingers. But the purpose of us being here is to hopefully fatten the canon. Or thicken the canon.
Thicken, yes.
Thicken the discourse.
Yeah.
We do have one question, if we can do a final question, and then we'll go ahead and do our wrap up. And that question is, can you talk a little bit more about about healthism as a colonial export?
Absolutely. Like if we look back at the 20th century, during the progressive era, during this moment in which like nutritional science was really sort of popping off, and the euthenics movement, right? So like eugenics and euthenics are two separate projects, but they're actually, very deeply entangled. Like euthenics was the project that was oftentimes supported by 20th century domestic scientists or the home economics movement in the United States and the UK, where women were concerned with the nutritional health, how to keep the home, how to like train other people in scientific ways, in order to sort of like understand how to keep an optimized body, right? So one of the famous euthenticists who wrote Elaine Swallows Richard, she wrote this book all about the environmental study of euthenics. She puts it this way, that like eugenics is hygiene for the future, euthenics is hygiene for the present, right? So one is about eugenics is about like the future, right? Like who do we see in the future? And euthenics is about like, okay, so how do we actually get to that future, but by protecting those of us in the present? Yeah. And so one of the greatest exports or the sort of like imperial projects of the domestic science movement is the understanding of sort of the popularization of the calorie. And they do this in many different ways, like through literacy campaigns, food literacy campaigns, by opening up home economics programs in public education in the United States, but also in the US's, imperial ports, such as in the Philippines. Again, like native boarding schools began like experimenting with the calorie to sort of determine like how much food did someone need in order to survive, or like if we made sure that they had X amount of proteins and X amount of carbohydrates and X amount of fats, would they be better off than they were before? How would we track this? We would track this by the calorie. We would track this by their weight and height, and other forms of disposition. So really, like, the 20th century gives us this very rich way to think about like the export of healthism in its literal terms, as a colonial project, right? As an imperial project of American empire, that really sought to, sort of give us the idea that like health was entangled in a modern nation state. Right. And so like now we have all of these markers to talk about the modern nation state as one that is has specific amounts of mortality rates, specific amounts of bodies in this weight and height category, all these different kinds of things. And we can really trace it back to, this introduction in the 20th century.
Hopefully that offers some idea. Tigress.
Yes, thank you. So thank you both. We're going to go ahead and do our checkout question. We thank you both for being here. Thank you, Pro Bono ASL team, for staying with us. And the question that we always end on is there anything we didn't ask you about, or that you didn't ask each other, that you really want to make sure we leave with today? And Athia, I'll start with you.
I feel like I've talked a lot today, and I thank you all for listening and letting me talk about my research. It's getting me in the right mindset to do my defense on Tuesday. So thank you so much for like hanging in here and being here with me. And I will cede the rest of my time to Sonalee.
Oh my gosh. I was really interested to make sure that we had a conversation that was deeper than something superficial about AAPI Heritage Month. And what better than to remind us that third world feminisms have so much to contribute to the Fat Studies canon, and that it only benefits us all to fatten and thicken the discourse. And thank you for having us.
Thank you both. Before we sign off, will you please tell folks where they can find you if they want to learn more about your work, if they want to support your work? We do not ask for free labor from our presenters, but we do also encourage our audience to think about direct supporting to them, in addition to the ways that you all so generously support us at NAAFA so that we can offer these webinars free as a gift to our community. So will y'all tell people where they can find you, and if you want to, where they can pay you?
I'm on Instagram at the Fat Sex Therapist, and you can send anything to me, any kind of tip, to your local bail fund.
Thank you. Athia?
I am on Twitter at Athia_Choudhury. You can contact me via my website, also under my name, and any kind of tip to me. I've never been asked to be given a tip before outside of my server days. So I would say just like pass it on to someone in need.
And folks, if you don't have an idea of who that might be, you can check out the Fat Mutual Aid Fund on Instagram. They might have some great ideas for you. If you're interested in supporting NAAFA, you can do that by visiting us at naafa.org/give. You can give by credit card or debit card there. You can also give by PayPal there, and there's other information about other kinds of long-term giving. We do really appreciate the support that we get from all of you who join us for these webinars webinars, and from everyone across community who supports these webinars, whether they can make it or not. Once again, we hope to see you for our upcoming Pride Month webinars, and as we have done this month, things that we don't get into the month of designation, we still intend to have, so we can look forward to having more API intellectualism, more third world feminism, more pride, all of those things beyond the month of June, and we will also see you in August for Fat Liberation Month, where we'll be pumping up with even more programming, even more sessions like this and other activities. So stay tuned for more details about that. Once again, on behalf of the board of the National Association to Accept Fat Acceptance, I thank you all for joining us today for the NAAFA webinar series. We'll see you next time. Take care.